We have all rightfully heard and condemned the transatlantic slave trade, but very few people have heard about, much less condemned, the more barbaric Arab-Muslim slave trade. Now, why is that? Is it only wrong when the innocent and simple people of Africa are enslaved by white Christians? Or is it considered too politically incorrect to condemn the barbarity of non-white people against black people? Videos like these do get demonetized, so in order to spread my message far and wide, please hit those like and share buttons. And if you want to support my channel, then please consider becoming a member or patron. Islam, the ruling ideology of Arabia, codified slavery in its scripture and consequently sanctioned the enslavement of an entire continent's people. This slave trade lasted for nearly 13 centuries, making it much longer and more brutal than the transatlantic slave trade. It baffles the mind that despite being the cause of so much suffering for African people, Islam still ended up becoming a major religion on the continent. According to the World Book Encyclopedia, Christians make up 45% of the African population, followed by 40% of Muslims. We understand today's African Americans are angry at white America because they recognize the suffering they had to endure because of the transatlantic slave trade, but we don't see the same anger directed towards Arabia, which was influenced by Islam. Can you imagine a world where 40% of Jews are Nazis? That's exactly like that. Africans embracing and idolizing Islam is like Jews embracing and idolizing Nazism. Muslim apologists love to tell you that yes, slavery is allowed in Islam, but we have been told to treat them kindly, as though this absolves Islam of all ill-doings that slavery brings upon its victims. Whenever this argument is presented by a Muslim apologist, always ask them, if I treat you kindly, would you be okay to be my slave? Their ums and ahs will give you your answer. The lengths to which some Muslims will go to defend their religion are remarkable. They will even defend slavery. A slave is not your equal. A slave, no matter how kindly you treat him, does not even have autonomy over his own body. Slave-defending Muslims try to paint a rosy picture and make us falsely imagine a world where Muslim slave owners and slaves are living in this beautiful world full of rainbows and sunshine. It's like they would have a world where a master is commanding his slave to wash his feet or clean the house, and slave in return would say, "Sorry, I don't feel like performing these duties today, and if you insist, let me remind you that Islam told you to treat me kindly." There is no way a slave can say that to his master. A slave has to drop everything and obey his master's commands. This is not like a modern employee who gets wages in return for his services and is free to leave whenever he wants. Every Muslim who tries to defend slavery from this point needs to understand that no amount of justification can make slavery okay. Having said all of that, I have to be fair. To the best of my knowledge, there is no other culture that has insisted so much on being kinder to slaves than Islam. There are tons of hadiths where Prophet Muhammad has told Muslims to speak kindly to slaves, don't overburden them, etc. But that does not absolve Muhammad from not abolishing slavery altogether, like he banned alcohol, gambling, usury, premarital sex, etc. All of which was prevalent in pre-Islamic Arabia. No slavery will always be better than treating slaves kindly. Now that I've managed to explain why slavery is evil, can't imagine I still have to explain that in the 21st century, you need to understand that Islam is a very aggressive ideology that believes in conquering lands and enforcing its own world order on other people. Right after Muhammad's death, Islam began its outward expansion by conquering neighboring territories. As the Islamic empire grew, so did the need for labor. Initially, the trade was focused on the capture and enslavement of non-Muslims from regions such as Persia, India, and Central Asia. However, as the demand for labor grew and these sources of slaves became more difficult to access, Arab traders began to turn to Africa. One of the most common methods used by Arab traders to capture slaves in Africa was raiding. This is very similar to what Prophet Muhammad did. These raids were often carried out by Arab militias who would travel inland from the coastal trading posts and attack African villages and settlements. The goal of these raids was to capture as many people as possible and bring them back to the coast to be sold into slavery. This is right up Prophet Muhammad's alley. Prophet Muhammad as well used to raid neighboring villages and tribes and used to capture men, women and children as slaves. One such example can be found at the time of the conquest of Banu Qurayza. After the people of Banu Qurayza surrendered, Prophet Muhammad had all the men killed and took their women and children as slaves. By the way, in this barbaric episode, anyone who had pubic hair was considered a man. This story can be read on Prophet Muhammad's biography, The Life of Muhammad, page 464. This, however, was not an isolated incident. In another instance of Muhammad attacking a tribe at a place called Otas, he took their men and children as slaves and their women as sex slaves. This is noted in the Sahih Hadith Sunan Abi Dawud 2155. In another instance, after the Battle of Hunain, Muhammad and his companions spoiled themselves with tons of slaves and slave girls. This story is mentioned in Sunan Abi Dawud 2158, and the list goes on and on, which deserves a separate video on its own. But this video is about Africa and its people. So, Arabs raiding African villages and taking their people as slaves is a practice directly inspired by the example of Prophet Muhammad. Now, tell me again, how can any African defend Islam when the same ideology enabled this misery upon them? The conditions under which slaves were transported and sold were often brutal and inhumane. Slaves were typically chained and packed tightly into ships for transport across the Indian Ocean to the Arab world. Many died during the voyage due to disease, starvation, or mistreatment. Once they arrived at their destination, slaves were often sold at markets and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Female slaves did not only do house chores, but also attended to their masters' sexual needs. Slave markets were set up where men and women were sold as physical objects, totally depriving them of their human identity. During the times of the Prophet, Ibn Umar, son of Caliph Umar, used to put his hands in the breasts and legs of slave girls to inspect them before buying. As mentioned in Albani's book Irwa al-Ghalil, whenever Ibn Umar bought a slave girl, he exposed her legs and put his hands between her breasts and her bottom. And when he did it from behind clothes. Sex slavery is not only endorsed but also practiced by Prophet Muhammad and other revered figures of Islam. According to Imam Ghazali in his book Hayaul Ulum, Caliph Umar used to have sex with multiple slave girls after breaking the fast, so that the devil could not contaminate Umar's mind with sexual thoughts. Many of these African girls and women were taken from their homes and families and forced to walk long distances, often in chains, to the Arab world. According to many jurists of Islam, such as Imam Ibn Hanbal, female slaves were only allowed to cover up the part between their belly button and knees. The rest of the body was supposed to be naked, including the breasts. According to Sahih Hadith, Musannaf Ibn Shaba 6236, Umar once saw a slave girl that belonged to us wearing a headscarf, so Umar hit her and said, "Do not assume the manners of free women." Furthermore, according to Respectable Sunan al-Kubra, volume 2, page 227, Anas, a respectable companion of the Prophet, once visited Umar and saw topless slave girls serving him. Don't believe me? Check out this statement by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf.
And the truth is, in an Islamic system, in traditional Islam in Medina, there were women walking around bare-breasted. And that is a fact, historical fact. And you can read it and look it up in the books. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu did not allow the imam to wear the hijab. He did not allow them to wear the hijab. So there were uncovered women in Medina. That is a fact. Historical fact. Muslims should get out of this obsession with women.
When you have examples like these of the early Muslims, of course its followers are going to emulate them, especially when it is considered virtuous. Just ask yourself, how many African women who were enslaved by Arabs had to endure this humiliating experience through centuries? All of this could have been avoided had Prophet Muhammad just abolished slavery. Muslims love to tell us that he was the greatest revolutionary to have ever walked the earth. I think Abraham Lincoln was better in this regard at least. Estimates of the number of Africans enslaved in the Arab-Muslim slave trade vary widely, but it is believed that tens of millions of people were captured and sold over the centuries. According to some estimates, as many as 17 million people were sold into slavery by Arab traders between the 7th and 20th centuries. But what am I saying? Muslims will be saying, "Oh, Haris, you are only mentioning the bad bits of Islam," as though there are any good bits in slavery. When we talk about the Arab-African slave trade, we have to talk about the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire was one of the largest and longest-lasting empires in history, spanning several centuries and covering much of the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeastern Europe. During its peak, the Ottoman Empire brought millions of people from Africa for labor. However, just on a side note, the empire had a particular interest in bringing blonde-haired slave women from Eastern Europe, something they couldn't get from Africa. Yes, behind every evil act of a Muslim, there is an example of Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad also used to tempt his soldiers with blonde-haired slave women. He enticed his soldiers to attack the Byzantine Empire so they could acquire blonde women as slaves. In the commentary of the Quran, chapter 9, verse 49, Ibn Kathir explains an event in which a man named Abu Wahab refused to take part in attacking the Byzantine Empire. So Prophet Muhammad asked him, "Oh, Abu Wahab, would you not like to have scores of Byzantine women and men as concubines and servants?" In response, Abu Wahab replied, and this is funny, check it out, "Oh, Messenger of Allah, I am very fond of women. And if I see the women of the Byzantines, I fear I will not be able to hold back. So please do not tempt me by them." Back to Africa. One of the most brutal practices associated with the Ottoman slave trade was the castration of male slaves. Castration was typically performed on boys between the ages of 8 and 12 with the goal of creating eunuchs who could be trusted to serve as harem guard or occasionally some other positions of power. The procedure involved removing the testicles and sometimes the penis as well, obviously without any proper medical care. Many young African boys died during or shortly after the procedure, and those who survived were left permanently scarred and often suffered from chronic pain and other health issues. This is the reason today there are only 5 to 20,000 Afro-Turks who trace their origin to the Ottoman slave trade. Their number should have been in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, had they not been castrated. Contrary to what these Muslim apologists would tell you, these Africans were not being treated kindly or were happy being slaves. Like in many other enslaving cultures, African slaves living under the heel of their Arab masters also revolted in what is now known as the Zanj Rebellion, which took place in southern Iraq in the 9th and 10th centuries. The rebellion was led by a group of African slaves who had been brought to the region to work in the salt mines. The slaves rebelled against their masters, launching a series of attacks on the surrounding cities and towns. The rebellion was eventually put down by the Abbasid military, and thousands of slaves were killed or captured and sold into further slavery. This episode is very similar to the rebellion orchestrated by Spartacus. Like Spartacus, the rebels of Zanj fought for their freedom, but unfortunately they were brutally subdued by their masters. Even Muslim historians such as Al-Tabri and Al-Masudi considered the Zanj rebellion as one of the most vicious and brutal uprisings that plagued the Abbasids. So how did the suffering of millions of people over the centuries end? If it was left to Islam and Muslims, the suffering of African people would have kept going to this day. One key factor in the decline of the Arab-Muslim slave trade was the growing involvement of the British Empire. Yes, as bad as the 19th century British Empire was, the British along with the French were among the first European powers to take action against slavery, and in the 19th century they launched a series of naval campaigns to suppress the Arab-Muslim slave trade in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. These campaigns were aimed at intercepting slave ships, freeing enslaved individuals, and disrupting the networks that sustained the trade. Yes, my dear African people, the Europeans and the Americans did cause a lot of suffering to Africans, but the Europeans, particularly the British, also played a significant role in ending it. One notable example of British intervention in the Arab-Muslim slave trade was the East Africa Anti-Slavery Expedition of 1873 to 1876. However, the Ottomans who represented the Muslims were insistent on slavery. According to the historian Bernard Lewis in his book What Went Wrong, the British forced the Sultan to abolish slavery. However, to be fair, there was also a growing reform movement within the Ottoman Empire to abolish slavery and jizya for non-Muslims. As a result, a decree was issued on February 18, 1856, which abolished jizya and the slave trade. Upon hearing about this, the Sharif of Mecca issued a fatwa that deemed it un-Islamic and said that Turks were infidels and that it was okay to kill them. All of that because they recognized the world was changing and they wanted to end slavery. Islamically, the Sharif was right, as according to the Quran, chapter 65, verse 1, not even Prophet Muhammad can outlaw anything that Allah has declared legal. So if slavery had been legalized by Allah, how could a 19th century Muslim like Sultan Abdul Majid can take away sex slaves from Muslims? Fair point, I think. As a result of this new law, the Arabs rebelled against their Turkish rulers, but the rebellion was brutally crushed by the Ottomans. However, the Sultan recognized the problem and allowed slavery to continue in the Hijaz region, present-day Saudi Arabia. However, despite the existence of this law, slavery and sex slavery continued to be practiced throughout the Muslim world. The Ottoman Empire abolished slavery with the adoption of the Turkish constitution in 1924 upon its dissolution. The decline of the Arab-Muslim slave trade was not solely due to British intervention. A variety of factors contributed to its eventual demise, including the rise of nationalism and the growing influence of Western ideas about human rights and freedom, which was the exact opposite of Islamic values. Saudi Arabia and Yemen were the last countries to abolish slavery in 1962. The simple reason for this delay is that Islam sanctions slavery like no other religion. You might say that Christianity also sanctions slavery, but the key difference is that the vast majority of Christians gave up dogmatically believing in the religion centuries ago. Muslims, on the other hand, still want to believe in Islam as dogmatically as possible. The belief is that the more dogmatic you are, the better you are. I have never met anyone who doesn't like Muhammad Ali, and I'm no different. After all, he was, I am the greatest icon of all time. But he was so wrong about Islam. The irony is that he dropped his name Cassius Clay, calling it a name given to him by slave-owning Americans, when in reality, Cassius Marcellus Clay was an abolitionist who founded the abolitionist newspaper called The True American. Unfortunately, Muhammad Ali didn't know about this, and he swapped his name from anti-slave activist Cassius Clay to probably the greatest slaver of all time, Muhammad. I hope this video gets great traction in Africa and African Americans, so give this video a like to help the algorithm, as critical videos like these often get demonetized. I hope African Muslims and blacks in general who are sold Islam as the most non-racist religion get to see Islam for what it truly is, a slave-enabling religion that has hurt the Africans the most. If you are angry at white Christians for bringing immense suffering upon your people, then you have to hold Islam to the same standards. If you like my video and would like to support my channel, then you can be my patron by going to patreon.com/xmuslim, or you can simply buy me a coffee.